Welcome to the Dare to Multiply podcast. On this podcast, we help passionate Jesus followers become courageous, obedient disciples who impact their communities for the kingdom of God. I'm your host, Cynthia Anderson, a disciple multiplication coach and trainer. We have some amazing guests coming up, people who are taking risks to launch new discipleship movements in their areas. I can't wait to learn from them and introduce you to their ministries. Together, we'll show you how to make and multiply disciples and groups in your area. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any tools or content coming your way. I also wanted to mention a free newsletter on disciple making that I send out every single week. It's called Daring Disciples, and it's all about how to share your faith, overcome obstacles we all face in the journey toward multiplication. To subscribe to that, go to daretomultiply.com/newsletter. Let's dare to multiply. Happy New Year! This is airing on December 31st, and I want to be the first one to wish you a Happy New Year as we wrap up and celebrate all that God has done in 2024 and head into the new year, 2025. I pray and hope that this will be an incredible year for you. Well, I want to talk today about how leaders are learners. And every year, as I finish one year and head into the new, I take stock and I think about and talk to God about and pray about, how did I grow this past year? What did I learn? And especially, how am I more like Jesus today than I was at the start of the year? And to be honest, some years I have to admit I'm not a whole lot more like Jesus than I was. And these are important evaluations and reflections for us to go through. I often will go on a retreat and spend time with Jesus, first looking back. And just like we do in the 3/3, we look back, we look up, and we look forward as we reflect on what God has done and what He wants to do in the coming year. I haven't yet had that retreat, but I'm going to be doing that very soon. Well, I realized that this podcast was going to be aired on December 31st, and I thought, wow, it would be fitting for me to share some of the things I've learned about disciple multiplication and movements in 2024. I've been so privileged to interview amazing people this past year on the podcast, learned so much from them. And I've also had some really amazing conversations with people, learning from other movement leaders and practitioners at some of the gatherings I've gone to. I've learned things in the field this past year as I've tried and experimented with things as a disciple maker myself. I've read many books about disciple multiplication. I'm an avid reader. I'm always reading new books. And I just want to say, leaders are learners. If you want to be like on the cutting edge of what God's doing, we can't just rely on what we learned 5 or 10 years ago as movement practitioners or church planners, or maybe in your initial DMM training that you took. But God is constantly doing new things and working in new ways. And we need to ask ourselves, how are we tracking with Him and what He is doing? What is God teaching us? So I'll be right back in a few minutes with a recap of some of the key things I've learned in this past year. And we'll be pointing to some of the episodes as well in our show notes about that. So I'll be right back in just a moment. Are you busy but not seeing the fruit you long for? Dissatisfied with your present level of impact on those around you? Or frustrated with traditional methods of discipleship that don't seem to be effective? If so, the Getting Started in Disciple Making Movements course may be just what you need. Inside the Getting Started program, you'll get access to a step-by-step proven approach to making and multiplying disciples. Not only will you receive 25 short and practical video teachings spread out over 6 modules, but you'll have a chance to connect with others for group coaching via our monthly Zoom calls And even more importantly, you'll become part of a global community of like-minded people from all over the world who are passionately committed to following Jesus and impacting others around them. If you want to get unstuck and begin moving forward as a disciple who makes disciples, I encourage you to go to courses.dmmsfrontiermissions.com and sign up for this powerful program today. And now to today's episode. Well, there are so many things that God has taught me and that I've been learning about disciple multiplication and movements in 2024. I really am so grateful for the people I've been able to interview on the podcast and the conversations I have had. So let me dive into the first one. The first thing was I had heard of micro churches, but I really didn't know what they were. And how are they different from a Discovery Bible Study group or a house church? And so I went to a microchurch conference that was hosted by Kansas City Underground there in Kansas City itself. And microchurch leaders from all over the United States gathered there. And I was able to sit at tables and hear people's experience and learn what is a microchurch and how is it different and how is it the same? What kinds of things are they also doing that we also do in disciple making movements or DMMs internationally and globally? One of the things that's different is it's not as focused on unreached peoples as we see in the DMM CPM world, right? They're really trying to find ways through the microchurch to engage with people in Western countries, and especially in the United States and now in Europe, we're seeing many of these microchurches. In some ways, you could say it contrasts to the mega church. It's not a traditional church that happens to meet in a home. It does have a lot of similar characteristics to a house church, but people who maybe are disillusioned with the mega church experience have been quite attracted to the micro church idea. And I think there's still a lot of experimentation going on, right? It's still a fairly new concept, a new thing that people are working with. And sometimes we're seeing examples like Matt Ulrich talked about with the Greenhouse Church, how there's a mega church offered, and then there's also a micro church in the same network, so that people kind of have the option of choosing either the mega church or the micro church experience while still being in the broader network of churches. So that's something new that I hadn't ever seen. I ask a lot of questions about how do they multiply? Do they multiply in the same kinds of ways or differently? Are they just kind of a smaller church experience? Are people outward focused or inward focused? And I think it varies. You know, some people that I met there seem to be pretty inward focused and kind of they don't like the mega church for various reasons. And so they're attracted to this smaller group church, the smaller group experience in church. And yet, some of them are really embracing multiplication principles and really working to be outward focused in how they are working. I also saw that the microchurch movement is not quite as focused on the unreached peoples as the DMM CPM world is, right? Which is really started in places where there are a lot of unreached people groups and those who have never heard the gospel before in Africa and in Asia, while the microchurch is an attempt to, in a sense, contextualize and bring some of the learnings and things that have been discovered in the DMM world into a situation in the Western context. So, really good podcast interview I had with someone from the Kansas City Underground, Matt Ulrich, and that podcast. We'll put those in the show links. But the microchurch is definitely worth exploring. In some ways, it still has the word church there, you know, and is considered a church. So, for a denomination to embrace micro churches along with mega churches may be an easier step to take. Anyway, a lot of interesting things to continue to learn and see there in the micro church movement that's happening in the United States and in Europe. Another thing that I learned this year and learned about was I met Alan Hirsch at that conference. And I was able to hear him speak about the centrality of Jesus is Lord in movements. And I've read some of his books. I had read them before, but I read some new ones and was just fascinated. Now, Alan, I'll have to say, is a bit of an intellectual. So if you read his books, you need to be somebody who reads at a fairly high level of English, maybe not so much writing for second language English speakers. But Alan has a lot of good things. He has gone after the multiplication of movements in the Western context. And so, really, really one of the key leading, I would say, leading influencers, leading speakers, and thinkers in the area of movements and multiplication in the Western context, and really shifting the culture to a movement mentality. He talks about this centrality of Jesus is Lord, which is very similar to obedience based discipleship, which we talk about with DMMs and CPMs. But I really liked the way that Alan brought the centrality of Jesus back into our thinking. And sometimes I feel like in disciple making movement circles, we're so focused on multiplication that he multiplication's at the center rather than Jesus being at the center. And I really think that was an important shift in my thinking that has happened this year, that Jesus is really the center of everything we do. And that sounds kind of funny because of course I knew that, but Alan really helped me refocus to Jesus is Lord being at the center of all we do as we pursue multiplication and movement. And I also read Practicing the Way last year, but John Mark Comer, I was reading and watching some of his podcasts. And this year, I think God really has been speaking to me and teaching me about how intimacy with Jesus is the end goal. It's the end vision. It's the end of our discipleship pathway. The end of our discipleship pathway is not multiplication, right? And I know I've seen in different charts and even in some people I really respect in their discipleship pathway chart, it ends with multiplication. It's a circle and it goes around and you get to that closure where you've completed the discipleship pathway when you start to multiply. But I really feel like this is an important for me to realize, and even in those I'm training, that multiplication is not the end goal. The end goal is that we become more like Jesus, that we start to look like him in greater ways, and our intimacy with him has grown. And that's what we are pursuing. That spiritual formation is what we are heading into as we pursue and obey him. And as multiplication happens, that it's not the end, right? Producing fruit is not the end. The end is becoming like Jesus. And I think this is a really key, important shift that I think I've been learning about this year. Another thing I learned and was exposed to this year through Alan and through Neil Cole was APEST, or APEST leadership teams, apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, and teacher. And the importance of intentionally making sure that our leadership groupings or our eldership groups in these movements have all of these gifts represented in them. They that it's not just the apostle, right, who leads the movement, or just one single dynamic leader leading alone, but it's these teams of people with unique and different gifts: the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, the shepherd, the teacher, all of these gifts working together in that close bond of friendship in your senior leadership teams within the movement. And so this was something that I'm continuing to chew on. I'm thinking about it for our nonprofit that we lead, Disciple Makers Increase. I'm thinking about it with the movement leaders that I'm coaching and working with. How can we make sure that movement leadership has all of these fivefold gifts represented within it, and that no one of these gifts is more important than the other, that all of them need to be represented in these leadership groupings. So important. Another thing I've been exploring and learning about and want to learn more about in the coming year as well is how it can look when a mega church and a micro church work together in unity to pursue the multiplication of disciples, right? So often we have this either or thinking, and many DMM practitioners are really negative towards the mega church. Many kind of put down, we might call it the elephant church. And sometimes we say we're not against the elephant church, but in some ways the way that we talk, and the way that we teach sort of communicates that we value the rabbit church more, or we think the mega church or the elephant church has no place or no role to play anymore. And I don't think that's true. I've never thought that was true, but this year I've been learning more about how can these two things work together? How can the elephant and the rabbit work together to multiply disciples? And as I said, I still have a lot more to learn about that in the coming year. In fact, I'm really interested to possibly write another book about that, or at least some more articles. But I've learned this year from Jerry and Kimberly Dearman out in California, a husband and wife who Jerry leads the house church part of things and the Jesus disciple work. And Kimberly, his wife, is the pastor of the mega church, right? That's there in their city. And so this husband wife team, one who is really trying to build this mega church, and one who's really trying to build a multiplying network of disciples. And I am learning from them and watching and seeing how they're experimenting with this and what it can look like when these two entities work together in unity. House churches working together with mega churches, and how we can be the body of Christ in a city or in an area, in unity, going after the multiplication of disciples. So much more to explore and learn there. I was able to visit out in Pennsylvania and get to know some of the Dove Network practitioners there who are working with House Church Network, and also they have mid-sized churches and they have mega churches there in the Dove Network. So fascinating to see how they are doing this, working together, but also pursuing multiplication. So, like I said, I'm learning. There's much more to learn there, but we wanna be learners and always learning, not just rejecting, something that isn't in our sort of niche, right? People who have a passion to reach the lost, let's work together to see. We may have different approaches, but what can we do to see disciple multiplication in our particular region or city? Another thing I've been learning just right here in our local work, right? And I don't do a lot of local work here with ties, but I'm definitely always out trying to share Jesus with my neighbors. And when I'm in the market or I'm in a grab taxi or something. And so I'm always interested to learn more about what's the most effective way to reach Buddhists? And I've been having discussions with other fruitful practitioners here in Thailand. And one of the things I learned is that what works well in a Western context does not necessarily work well with Buddhists here in Thailand. And you definitely can't say one size fits all, right? And so we want to look at what works for where we are. And one of the things I've been discovering personally in my experimentation, and also as I talk to others, is that um, understanding what people's needs are in their life and then offering prayer is a really fruitful, effective way to connect with Buddhist people. It touches the heart. And sharing about the love of God with Buddhists, which is very much based on fear. Don't do this, don't do that. If you don't do this, you're going to have bad karma, you're going to have bad things happen to you. But sharing about the love and compassionate Jesus and how he he wept when Lazarus died. He cared so deeply for people, and introducing Jesus in that way and offering prayer and then watching Jesus do miracles. That's been something I've been experimenting with and learning about how to reach Buddhists this past year, and especially in the last month or two. Another thing that this year was really significant for me, and I definitely had a big takeaway, was when I interviewed Rhonda, and she talked about how it's so important to have clarity about your role as you are working to multiply disciples, and that not everyone is a movement catalyst or a movement starter. Not everyone is going to become a movement leader, right? And movement leaders, are kind of rare, right? But everyone can multiply disciples, and we all are called to, and we all need to. But not everyone is going to catalyze a movement. But some people are called to a role of being a movement accelerator, where they come alongside someone who does have that anointing to catalyze a movement, and they help to provide resources and tools and things that can come alongside. They're a movement servant, not necessarily a movement catalyst. And how it's important to know what your role is, right? And while we all pursue multiplication and we want to dare to multiply, that's what the name of this podcast is, right? And we go after multiplication, but also realizing that if we don't see fourth generation, 1,000 believers, and hundreds of house churches started, we're not a failure, right? But there's maybe some ways that we can partner with movements that are existing or serve them, pray for them. There's things that we can do to participate in the global movements that God is bringing that are also just as valid as roles. I thought that was such an important insight that Rhonda gave, and that, yeah, and I've been learning about that. So, loved that insight. And then I forget when, but a few months back, I had Nick Ripken also on the show, and we talked about persecution. And this year, I believe God has been teaching me and teaching some of us that work together about persecution. And we've experienced a lot of persecution in some of the teams and people that we coach. Many martyrs, many have died for their faith. And really understanding how to prepare people for persecution. Nick talked about the dangers of pulling people out of persecution, extracting them, especially sending them abroad, and how that often is so detrimental to them. Many actually even fall away from the Lord when that happens. But how to, and we've come up with a Disciple Makers Increase, again, the organization I lead, a value related to persecution, and that we have decided that persecution is normal. It's normal in the Christian life, and we must embrace it as part of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. Persecution is normal. We normalize persecution, and we also really felt like it's important that we make a decision, that we will not remove people from persecution. If their life's in danger, we may move them to another locality, from the immediate danger, but we won't remove them from their people group. We won't remove them from their context where they can be most fruitful, where they can be most effective, because it's not good for them, and it's certainly not good for the movement. So many things that God has taught me this year. The one that I want to close with is just I've been learning a lot about eldership in movements and what that looks like, and especially from some of our friends who are leading some of the movements in Indonesia. I've been watching a series of videos about that and how they develop eldership and how they develop leaders within the movement, how eldership works in the movement. I've written about this some, and some of the things I've been learning, but such an important key thing as we look at families and movements that are beginning to emerge in some of the people that I've been coaching. So these are some of my big takeaways. I don't know which of these are important for you, but we're going to put each of the links to these different things in the show notes so you too can learn about them. But I'm going to come back in just a moment with an action step for you as you wrap up 2024 and head into the new year.
Imagine a world where passionate followers of Jesus come together to multiply, transforming lives beyond imagination. Instead of toiling with little fruit, what if God's abundance flowed beyond your wildest dreams? Picture those you've invested in sharing Jesus freely, creating a ripple effect of disciple-making. In her new book, The Multiplier's Mindset, Cynthia Anderson reveals how shifting mindsets can revolutionize disciple-making. When Cynthia and her colleagues experienced these mindset shifts, they saw enormous results, including the launching of 19 multiplying movements in Africa and Asia, transforming tens of thousands of lives. This book will help you discover hidden harvesters, see church members move from passivity to passion, and release the power of simplicity in multiplying disciples. Don't remain stuck. Learn to move toward greater fruitfulness. Visit multipliersmindset.com and get your copy of The Multiplier's Mindset today.
Okay, so as you think back on 2024, ask yourself the question, what did I learn? What did I learn? What has God taught me about life in general, about who He is? What aspect of His character did He really highlight for me this past year? Maybe through trials you went through. You found Him to be your protector or your provider. What is it that God has been teaching you about who He is? And then more particularly, ask yourself, as I did, what have you been learning about disciple multiplication? You know, as I said at the start of this episode, leaders are learners. If you are a leader, even of yourself and your team, leaders need to be learners. We constantly are learning and growing. And so I would just ask you, as your action step, what will you do in 2025 to lean in to learning and growing as a disciple multiplier? What books will you read this year? I know I'll be putting together a list of my top 10 recommended books on disciple multiplication. I'll be putting that out on social media, so watch for that if you're looking for suggestions. But ask yourself, are there some books I want to read this year? Are there some courses I want to take? Of course, our course there, Getting Started in Disciple Making Movements, is one that you might consider. Or if you've already taken that, maybe this year you should consider taking our second level course, Moving Forward in Disciple Making Movements. Or maybe there's another course that another organization offers. What could you do to continue to learn and grow? Maybe there's a conference that you would want to attend, or mentors that you would like to seek out and say, hey, could I meet with you 2 or 3 times in the next year? I'd just love to pick your brain about what you're seeing happen. A lot of people may not want to sign up to be your coach for for your life, but they'd be willing to have a conversation where you could intentionally lean in and learn from them. And of course, keep listening to this podcast and we'll keep learning together. I've got some great people coming up in 2025 that I'll be interviewing. Lots more for all of us to learn together as God continues to teach us how to multiply disciples. So, your action step, take some time as the new year begins to look back and then to look forward. Set some goals for learning and be a leader who learns. God bless you guys. That's all we've got for this episode of Dare to Multiply. One thing that would really help both us and other people who might like to listen in is for you to rate and review the podcast, if you haven't done that yet, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'd also love to connect with you on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Feel free to message me with any topics, questions you'd like addressed, or guests you'd like me to interview. Until next week, then, please remember, no matter how ordinary you feel, God's dreams for us are always bigger than we can imagine. Let's dare to trust Him for a greater harvest.